Great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to the first day of the conference yesterday, and my impression was that a little of that focused on intergenerational exchanges and transfers and influences within families. And in a way, today I'm trying to look more widely at how these function across entire national economies. And indeed, part of the critique you could make of what's happening in terms of intergenerational equity is that we are better parents than we are citizens. And there's a massive investment and increasing investment in our own kids, and our influence on them is powerful. But are we, as citizens, ensuring that the next generation as a whole have a fair deal? And that's what my book, The Pinch, is about. But first, to get the absolute basics, and I actually find the number of babies born in many ways a more important economic and social indicator than things like TFRs. And this simply tells us how many babies have been born for over the last century or more. I personally think it's quite a good predictor if you track through the effects. So thinking back to my time working for Margaret Thatcher, in it we had, at one point, we reached a balanced budget. And if you look at the fiscal pressures then, look at the very low number of babies born in winter war years. That means the state pension budget was not really under significant pressure. Look at the surge in the number of babies born to the second peak of the baby boom in the early 60s. That meant lots of young people entering the labour force, a great time for structural economic change. So these factors shape wider demographic environments within which governments operate. They also have social effects. I buy the argument that concentrations of large numbers of young people are also disruptive, innovative, challenging. The first baby boom peak, 1947, 20 years later, you have the Grosvenor Park riots against Vietnam. And the second one, 20 years later, you have the poll tax riots, the two biggest riots in London in the post-war period. And even now, in the shifts that you see, that most recent peak in the 2012, 2013, followed by a significant fall, tells us at the moment we have increasing numbers of young people trying to get into further education, apprenticeships, higher education. Well, at the same time, one of the most fraught political issues in every local authority is which school should close because we have fewer young children. And reconfiguring the education budget just to reflect the fact that the number of people in their teens is still rising and the number of people under 5 is falling fast is a significant policy challenge. And these issues become much clearer if you just look at that basic evidence. It's also, I think behind it, there's a very interesting question, which is if you had a choice, whether you would wish to be born in a large cohort or a small cohort, which would you opt for? And there is a view amongst many demographers, which looks like common sense, that if you had a choice, go for a small cohort, fewer people, less pressure in the jobs market, fewer people trying to buy the house at the same time as you. And of course, there's sophisticated economics, relative returns to labour and capital. The story of rising wages after the Black Death, maybe there's an economic argument as well for that. The argument in my book, basically, is that it's turned out that being a big cohort, it works massively to your advantage in a modern democratic market economy. It means you've got voting power and it means you've got market power. That's why the Rolling Stones are still on tour. There's a lot of us who still, and I think it's an interesting debate, which is never going to be fully resolved. So that's the backdrop.
By that for immigration.
Oh, well, you can, and it is the case that some of the surge of immigration does appear to plug some of the troughs. And indeed, post-war, there was a definite attempt to recruit migrant labour because of the low birth rate since. Yeah. So let me just go through, first of all, incomes, and then I'll do incomes and welfare, and then we'll look at assets. So this, and although there's a lot of cultural and social weight attached to these generations, a lot of the best analysis, to be rigorous, you go in 5-year age cohorts. And a lot of the evidence I'm going to give through my presentation is 5-year age cohort evidence. And if you look here, you see for those green and blue lines, you see a classic picture where after 5 or 10 years, as you enter the labour market, your hourly earnings are significantly higher than people in a 5-year cohort 10 years earlier. But then over on the left-hand side, the more recent cohorts in the purple and red, you can see much more bunching. So that's the start of a basic story, that it doesn't look as if the prospect of every new cohort having higher earnings has been delivered in the same way more recently. And because so much of the activity is over on the left, let me now just concentrate on that tiny bit. This is a close-up of the more recent cohorts. And you can see it is not totally catastrophic. And indeed, the 2001-2005 5-year cohort does look to be doing, if anything, a bit better. And we think the driver of that, at Resolution Foundation, we think the driver of that is the minimum wage. And the significant increases in the minimum wage over the last 5 or 10 years is having an impact. And this is another way of showing its impact, which is it is enabling people on lower pay, it's often where non-graduates are concentrated, to enjoy some catch-up with the earnings of graduates. It's not that the earnings of graduates have fallen in real terms, but it looks as if the earnings gap between graduates and people on the lowest pay has definitely been narrowing, and the minimum wage looks like a key driver. So that's a kind of very quick snapshot of what's been happening on earnings. Now let's look at benefits and tax, and then we can look at overall incomes. So this is a story. If you want an example of the exercise of political power by a large group, just look at how the benefit system has changed so that non-pensioners, working age families, have seen real cuts in the value of their benefits since 2010, whereas pensioners have seen significant increases in the real value of their pensions since 2010. And given that the Social Security budget is not infinite, we're talking here about absolutely clear trade-offs as to which groups are prioritized for benefit spend. And that tells us that pensioners have been prioritized for benefit spend. And interestingly, that benefit story is heavily driven by, of course, the triple lock. This shows how the triple lock, which was introduced with an expectation it would cost 5 billion a year. OBR now think it's probably going to end up within a year or two costing 15 billion a year, has driven significant increases in the value of the state pension ahead of earnings, ahead of prices. Whereas benefits for unemployed people, for example, have significantly lower, and the gap has got wider. That's a benefit story. The tax story is a bit different. And here it's interesting. The age allowance, the higher personal tax allowance you get if you're a pensioner, is gone. And also, and I think this has been a good policy, a lot of the cuts in direct taxation have been cuts in employee national insurance, and that has particularly helped people of working age. Maybe those tax went too far. Maybe the cuts have gone too far in terms of fiscal responsibility. But nevertheless, it's clear that the balance of tax changes has been rather different. And so the overall combined net change in income story is a bit more complicated. When I find myself trying to explain why I oppose the continuation of the triple lock, I do find that there is still a widespread belief pensioners are poor, poor people are pensioners. We have an obligation to these people struggling to make ends meet, and we need to help them. And look, that was absolutely true. That was a reasonable account of how you should approach British social policy 20 or 30 years ago. But what we can see here, in a way, is a successful intervention, increasing pensioner incomes. So it is no longer the case that if you're a pensioner, you're likely to have a lower income. This is after housing costs and equivalized, that a pensioner is likely to be somehow struggling to make ends meet with a lower income than a working age family. There is an extraordinary convergence, apart from amongst the very poor, where it's clear that pensioners, the poorest 10% of pensioners, are better off than the poorest 10% of working age families. So as I say, I think this is a success. This is why you can argue that measures such as the triple lock have been historically justified, but there is no case for carrying on further as if somehow we've still got to solve the problem that did face us 20 or 30 years ago. What we should do about it, and throughout the presentation, I was trying to give some rough indications of possible policy interventions. I do think that going to higher education is still a driver of a significant increase in earnings compared with people who don't go to university, including when you do proper rigorous analysis of people with similar backgrounds and similar education attainments. The ones who go to in higher education overall do better off than the ones who don't. And I do worry about pressures, both a media narrative that it's not worth it, driven, as I said, I think actually, if anything, by the minimum wage effect. And I worry about the cash pressures for people going to university. So I do think we need to provide more cash for people at university. Equally, however, we have obligations through to help people on non-higher education courses. We've got a model for financing higher education through fees and loans. You cannot apply a similar model to many other courses which do not have the same earnings premium attached, but they're also worthwhile. That's why I was one of the people advocating what was called the apprenticeship levy, now the growth and skills levy. But if you look at it, it's shocking, again, how older people have captured increasing proportions of spending from that levy. The majority of beneficiaries now are aged over 25. We should repurpose it and redirect it back towards younger people. And although the minimum wage story in many ways is a success, there will be at some point when the minimum wage just gets so high, it has very significant labour market effects and lowers employment prospects. And there is a real danger now that further increases in the youth minimum wage could be one of the drivers and could make youth unemployment worse. So we do actually think that the minimum wage increases should now be paused. So that's a kind of income story, both from earnings and benefits and tax. Now let's look at our wealth and assets story. Now, first of all, an observation that everybody in this room will be familiar with. But a lot of the time when you're trying to explain why Britain feels somehow like a more blocked or less equal society, when you go to the headline data, it's not immediately obvious. It's not the case that the inequality of incomes has significantly increased. Indeed, post the crash, if anything, some of the really top incomes of bankers and everyone suffered a lot. There was a time when you could even claim, if anything, a slight reduction in inequality. And similarly, the distribution of wealth doesn't appear to have become significantly more unequal. So if you just settle with those two lines, you say, what's the problem? It's striking, however, that wealth is significantly more unequal than income. And what has really happened is that wealth has become much more important relative to income. So an increase in the absolute value of wealth and its size relative to earnings, given that wealth is more unevenly distributed than income, can make a society feel more unequal and more blocked, even though neither the income story nor the wealth story is of growing inequality. And this is of course, it peaked somewhere at, basically the ratio has risen from 3 times GDP to 7 times GDP. That was partly caused by also the measurement effects of very low interest rates on how you value future pensions wealth. So there is now a correction underway as interest rates get back to more historically normal levels, but it's not going to completely reverse. I don't think there's any foreseeable prospect of being back to 3 times GDP, which was what we were used to.
what's in the measure of wealth and what's out, and what do we know about, for example, the move from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans, and how that might shape the patterns of wealth inequality?
Yeah, this is significantly driven by the wealth effect of defined benefit contributions, the future pension promise of a defined benefit pension, future pension promise being of very high value in an era of low interest rates. And that's one of the main drivers of the final peak and then the trough. That's significantly a defined benefit effect. I'll turn to DC when we get to auto enrollment later, but this is mainly a defined benefit pension promise effect. Here is...
So both defined benefit and defined contribution wealth are kind of buried in that graph?
Yes, this is from the Wealth and Asset Survey. This is all data from the Wealth and Asset Survey. This includes all those forms of pension wealth, and this is housing wealth as well. This is wealth as in the Wealth and Asset Survey. We've seen a surge in the value of wealth. Of course, the two main elements of wealth are pensions and housing. And what this shows is how the increase, it takes in away the previous story and presents it slightly differently, shows how much of those gains in value have been enjoyed by people in the later stages of their life. Now, to some extent, that's just an inevitable consequence of wealth typically being concentrated amongst people who are older. But it is striking how significant that surge is. And some of this surge is in forms of wealth that are simply not going to be accessible to the next generation. And I do think that what's happened to defined benefit pensions is a vivid example, again, of generational capture. The original company defined benefit pension scheme was almost a with-profits scheme. It did not have a cast iron guarantee of exactly what your company pension would eventually be worth. And when I was an MP and in both government and in opposition, successive legislation brought in by different parties of different political persuasions changed the company pension promise retrospectively. Inflation protection for early leavers, improved rights for your spouse after the member of the pension scheme died. So the defined benefit pension promise was legislated to become better and better. And eventually companies said the costs are now so high, we're going to close them. They couldn't get rid of the historic promise, but they closed them for new members. So it turned the defined benefit pension promise into a once-off generational offer, not available for younger generations who went particularly into DC defined contribution benefits, where they involve much greater element of risk and where there is no future pension promise guarantee. It's affected by whose value is affecting the way that the defined benefit promise is affected. So this is partly an effect which is not going to be available for future pensioners. There is the pension story in particular, but let me also show you the housing story, where again you can see significant increases in the value of the housing wealth held by older people, and if anything, no increase or even a decline in the value of the housing wealth held by younger people because they haven't been able to get started onto the housing ladder. So when you disaggregate into pensions and housing, in both cases you find that the usual life cycle effect seems to have been exacerbated by particular opportunities for one generation that are unlikely to be fully available for the next generation. And this is added up to making wealth more significant, but more unequal. So what should we do? And look, Julian Grant after me is going to get into much more detail about this. There are lots of ideas around for how you could provide an opportunity for younger people to get to build up some kind of asset. In our Intergenerational Commission report at the Resolution Foundation a few years ago now, we suggested a capital grant of £10,000. There are many other ways in which you could do it. And I think Julian is going to take you through more options and more radical options. The catchword for it is a bung for the young. And we would love to see something that offsets this difficulty for young people in building up property ownership. And in terms of financing, again, what we propose, and we're looking at all this again, and then our thinking was going to develop, but we also did think that inheritance tax would be a good way of funding this measure and a vivid example of how building up an asset should be a society-wide opportunity for everyone and should be slightly less dependent on inheritance. Because I suspect one of the reasons why the first day of this conference focused so much on the family and family transfers is it's also the case that if you have a society where wealth has risen so much relative to earnings, then becoming rich, suddenly family matters more, inheritance matters more, and securing wealth out of earnings is harder and harder. That's why suddenly the family is more significant, and it does have a wider impact on intergenerational relations. Don't row with your banker is a very good rule for the younger generation. Though some of them do tell me they have bought my book in order to give it to their parents for Christmas to get them to think further about their obligations. So some agenda of an active attempt to spread wealth ownership to the younger generation financed out of inheritance tax. I'm just going to dig, let's see how we're doing. I don't want to go on for that. Let me dig a little bit more deeply into the pensions policy options and the housing policy options. There is some good news on pensions. And the good news on pensions is auto-enrollment, a cross-party policy sustained over 10 or 15 years is working in that we now have a framework within which many people, particularly younger workers, are building up some kind of pension saving pot. That is good news. The bad news is it's a DC pot, so there's not much risk sharing in it, and also it's got relatively small amounts of money in it. But the good news is we now have a framework which has reached millions of people. And we think this is relevant for the policy debate about how you might try to help younger people build up an asset. Are there ways in which, having got this framework in place, we can now do a bit more with it? And again, at Resolution Foundation, we have proposed some mechanism which might, where you'd use it, you'd use the auto-enroll mechanism to collect a bit more money and put some of it into a liquid savings account so that it could be used on a rainy day. The extra bit, not raiding the contributions that are already happening, the 8% that's already going in, and then perhaps rolling it over into some kind of sidecar. So but again, there will be other people with other examples, but we think that is one kind of mechanism of how you might try to use auto-enrollment to boost savings in other ways. And indeed, our £10,000 capital grant for young people, especially if you have a more flexible auto-enroll model like this, one thing you could do with it is just pay the £10,000 into their auto-enrolled pension account, but with some of those extra freedoms. So you could imagine circumstances where you could use it, for example, to help towards a deposit for house purchase. So what we have proposed on pensions, we've also said that the triple lock needs to come to an end. It seems to us a reasonable basis for benefits, be they for young or old, that you might expect them over time to rise with earnings. And we think an earnings link across all benefits rather than a hyper souped up triple lock for pensions and something way below earnings for working age benefits would be a fair way of doing it. And historically, one of the ways in which the coalition government justified the introduction of the triple lock and said it would be funded was by raising the pension age, and the increase in the pension age from 66 to 67 is now underway. There was the IFS indeed have hosted some very interesting discussions of the extent to which we could go further and raise it from 67 to 68. As you do go up the age range, of course, you have more problems of older people for whom work is just difficult and for whom means-tested assistance or other forms of assistance would be necessary. But there is a window where you could go from 67 to 68 in the mid-30s. That window is closing rapidly. We think there's a case for trying to get on with that. And also, when we look at economic inactivity, and older people withdrawing from the workforce. Although in general, it's the case that Britain's private pension saving is an overall asset, overall policy gain, less dependence on benefits than in some continental countries. Nevertheless, it does have one regrettable side effect, which is that you can access, there is no retirement condition for anything, but you can in reality access your pot of private pension saving from the age of 57. That age is going up a bit, but maybe we should push that age up further so that being able to access your private pension savings is postponed till a bit later, just to strengthen the incentives to carry on working. Let me briefly dig into housing. And again, this is sorry.
Quick question. Do you have any observation on the Tony Blair think tank around giving 20 years of pension to all individuals? How you decide that's another question.
Yeah, I think that is how you decide it is indeed another question, and rather a tricky question. How you predict. You could imagine overall, in average. I mean, we've shifted to a kind of proportion of life ratio, and we're now. One of the arguments for increasing the pension age so far has been life expectancy is rising. Life expectancy may have stopped rising. That's itself controversial. So that would be another option. You could, I think what whereas in privatization we used to talk about a formula of RPI minus X. I think what you're talking about is RIP minus X, which is indeed one approach which could be considered. This is a story not unlike the pension story, where although there is a bit of good news, again, it looks as if the decline in the rate at which people become homeowners has come to an end. Nevertheless, compared with what the baby boomers have done, it's very hard to see it completely catching up with rates approaching 80% of home ownership. And again, a policy issue that is beginning to loom, that people think about. It is striking how quite a bit of social policy does still assume that by the time you're old, you're very likely to be a homeowner. A very large rented accommodation population paying potentially quite high private rents, way out into pension age and beyond, is a different environment from one in which we have been familiar with in the past. When you look at why the younger people are finding it hard to get onto the housing ladder, it's a very frustrating story because they often meet the loan to income requirements. And indeed, for many of them, even now, if they're in the private rented sector, the cost of sustaining a mortgage for an equivalent property could well be less than the cost of the rents they're currently paying. So it isn't that somehow they don't have the income that suddenly has made home ownership impossible. It's the deposit rules that are the barrier. Again, goes back, if you've got no savings, if you've got no other assets, if you haven't got the money to put in for the deposit as house prices have risen, that is the barrier. And again, that leads to some policy proposals. The obvious one, of course, build more houses. We do think there is some scope for reforming the mortgage rules so that some of those people who face essentially regulatory obstacles to taking out a mortgage, we think some of those regulations are too strict. And particularly, we think some program of targeted support to help with deposits for people who in all others, apart from the deposit barrier, would be able to sustain the cost of a mortgage, would be a way of helping younger people get onto the housing ladder. Now we are getting to the end. I had hoped to have a list of all 10, but anyway, I have given you, I hope, an account of both the basic trends on the income side and on the asset side. And through the presentation, I hope you have seen 10 policy proposals of things that could be done, which of course need further work and careful consideration, and look forward to discussions the rest of today. Thank you very much indeed.
interesting questions about getting rid of the triple lock, pushing up the age at which individuals can start to draw benefits. And there's sort of interesting issues about inequality, especially if there's increasing differences in longevity between low income and high income people. There's been some concern that if we raise the state pension age, many low income people will never live to actually get a penny out of it. And I was curious if you'd comment on that.
Well, it is, first of all, a legitimate point. I absolutely understand and recognize the point. I guess my view is that nevertheless, given that there are a lot of pensioners with good incomes, it would be cheaper if you were to raise the state pension age, but you would certainly need some kind of improved support for people in their 60s. I don't think you could get down into the details as of forecasting life expectancy individual by individual, but you would need some kind of improved quasi-pension credit support for people in their 60s but below pension age, means tests, and probably some more age-related disability payments for people. But when you cost a package like that, you can, if you've saved 10 billion on raising the pension age, you can put 5 billion into a package of the sort that your concerns would require.
Victoria, if you wish to add a question, please put it into Q&A and we'll ask it in the room.
Firstly, as you're aware, in the King's Speech, the legislation to enable consolidated defined contribution schemes being out, which is intended to be one way in which to at least spread the risk of defined contribution pots. Secondly, if somebody with a defined contribution pot wants to ensure that they've got an income for life rather than for the annuity amount, which they can take out. And the third point is just in terms of auto-enrollment and all that goes with it, which, as you said, has been a significant success. The trouble with it is it's in many senses a false promise, because the contribution level are by and large way too low to provide the sort of pensions that people seem to believe that they're going to get from DC. If you look at the Australian example, I think the rate is now 14% between employers and members. Even that's inadequate. The expected level of contribution and to give you a good lifestyle, it's close to 20%. And I think there's a grave danger that there are false promises and false hopes people have got in that whole area.
Yeah, I agree. And in your second and third points, they'll go together in that the money in these pots is so modest that if you did try to buy an annuity with them, it'd be quite a nasty shock. And you're absolutely right. Nothing like what people may be hoping for. I think the common thread, if I may say so, of your 3 points is one of my regrets. And I've had this conversation with my friend Adair Turner, who did the original Pensions Commission. The question is, there must be some hybrid intermediate model, which is less than the full-blown gold-plated defined benefit pension promise, and a bit better than you're on your own with this tiny pot with significant investment decisions. And I still think that and if you look between his interim report and his final report, he kind of gave, and again, he's explicit about this, he kind of gave up on defined benefit pensions. The question is, if then the proposal had been, here are all the extra requirements that have been added over the past 30 years, and they should all be removed so that the employer structured pension scheme is significantly less onerous, whether that might have saved some kind of provision, or if you approach the problem from the other end, whether there are forms of collective DC that involves some risk sharing, which is the Dutch system and what we have with the Royal Mail. Now, neither of those are easy or straightforward, and defining some kind of collective DC, you immediately find the intergenerational issues emerge. And as soon as you have members who are pensioners and members who aren't yet pensioners, if there's some external shock, which the CDC promise has to adjust, where is the adjustment born? So neither of those are obvious, but I think, and what's at the background to the legislation that's being considered is where people are trying to find some kind of middle way. And it should not be beyond the wit of man to construct something in that area.
So thank you so much, Matt. It's really useful to see everything brought together. I just want to kind of go to a different point in the discussion, which is presumption through most of this as being, in a sense, how individuals can be enabled to respond to the existing wealth distribution and, to some extent, ameliorate that. So I think there's a prime question, which is, why do you need wealth? So obviously wealth is about kind of managing risk, which is why we have the NHS, for example, which is one way to reduce the need for wealth. So there are kind of, if you take that forward, then you start to possibly open up a whole set of different policy thoughts, because if you look, for example, at the housing situation, again, apart from the build more homes, most of it is about how you enable people to get into a situation where we do have, I think, to be honest, a highly overvalued housing market, which means that a massive proportion of people's both rental and mortgage income. Thinking through how that itself could be changed, whether that's things like land value tax, different forms of maybe shared ownership, etc. I don't know, but being more thoughtful about why and what that wealth is necessary for and how to ameliorate the need for it is another balancing act to enable rebalancing, I guess.
Yeah, and that is an interesting thought. And how wealth has a set of functions. It's partly an income smoothing device, and you're absolutely right. The welfare state can also be thought of as an income smoothing device. And you could imagine if the welfare state did better, more ambitious income smoothing, would the requirements for wealth be less? It's an insurance device. Yeah, and so I think your perspective is a very valuable. Yeah.
Thank you very much, David. With the presentation. That is, the very first thing on that slide says building more homes. Yesterday afternoon, we had a really good talk from lots of people yesterday, but Aileen really particularly was talking about complex family structures, and we were talking a lot about, the way that new generations grow up. I made reference then to the Senate for Social Justice's report on Lost Boys, which I find very interesting report. And one of the things that they say there is Britain is suffering from an epidemic of fatherlessness. 2.5 million children in the UK have no father figure at home, representing 1 in 5 of all dependent children. And the thing is that, if you have a huge expansion of, people living alone and very, very small, isolated nuclear families, are we not actually sort of overlooking an underlying problem, which is the ability of actually doing family formation, building communities, and actually working together in that way, so people become more isolated? And in fact, things like social media and the extent to which people are isolated in that area is actually making that problem even worse. But should we not be tackling some of the root problems rather than the effects of what we have coming out, which is need for homes?
One of the interesting effects of the pressures in the housing market is, if anything, the number of young people living at home with their parents has gone up. So there is more intergenerational living of young people staying in the family home for longer. There are some interesting charities who are trying to link up frail old people living on their own and young people, maybe at university or for other reason moved away from where they were brought up to find work, who in the old days would have had a landlady and have been a lodger. And there are attempts to bring these together. It's quite interesting when you talk about intergenerational stuff. Another issue in my book, which is not quite today's economic focus, is but if you are wary of, if you think relations between generations are problematic and risky, unless they're either within the family or in some specified education institution, it's quite interesting. Social services faced with a little old lady and a young person who are not family connected living together. There's two sets of regulations, and the regulations assume each of them is a threat to the other. So first of all, they have to check that the little old lady is not going to be threatened and harassed by this, in your example, young man. And they also have to check that this young man, this vulnerable, is not going to be under threat from this old person. The social services regulations about intergenerational mixing are quite strict.
A couple of questions. One is about what are the prospects for getting cross-party agreement on an approach to pensions. I'd also put a sidebar in there that we do seem to get better value from annuities now that we have an Andy Burnham stay out of the gilts market. So they are looking better today than they were a month ago. And then the final question is actually related to information and fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I'm gonna say raise the area of student loans just in terms of and I know it's from a third of 6 kids or set kids to look at and look out for. It's just not knowing what the best thing to do is in respect to student debt. And I've done a straw poll survey of people here. Some people have paid it off, and some people have said it's on the kids. But if you were, say, a woman in her late 20s, 28, 29, pre-household formation, and you've got student debt of around 60 grand, what advice would you give her in terms of should you take a 60 grand payment as a gift to leave us from your parents, or should you put that down as a deposit, or should you have some other strategy?
Right. Yeah, I think on pensions and cross-party consensus, I mean, there's never. I think the prospects. Historically, there has been quite a lot of consensus, and indeed, the problem with triple lock now is that there's too much of a consensus. Parties are afraid of breaking ranks. I hoped in the run-up to the last election that the first manifesto to be published wouldn't have the triple lock, and then people would all have confidence. I do think there is, you could imagine a scenario where very informally there was some kind of understanding that's none of this promise the triple lock. Hard, but not impossible. On student debt, and look, I was the universities minister and was involved in all this. The fact is, I always thought what really matters is the cash payments. And the figures for debt, it is not even like American student debt. It's certainly not like a credit card debt or an overdraft debt. It's closer to saying these graduates are going to have got a debt of £500,000 of income tax, or probably more than that, £1 million of income tax they're going to pay during their working lives, probably. And we did indeed go to the Council of Mortgage Lenders and say to them, just to absolutely double check this, when you are looking at a graduate who has this obligation to pay at 9% above a certain amount, but has a pile of student debt, how do you treat it? And they say, yeah, the debt is not, if you've got 50,000 of debt, that's not 50,000 less of a mortgage you can take out. It's instead a fixed outgoing. What we'll look at is the deduction from salary as a fixed outgoing. So it is a living standards cost on the income side. But so many parents that I talk to about all this assume that it's a fixed volume of debt, and it's like saying my son or daughter has got a £50,000 overdraft and that lowers their mortgage. No, it's not like that. So my view is it's the last one to pay off. and look, I'm not a regulated financial advisor, but I would certainly, in the circumstances you describe, if someone did have tens of thousands of pounds to help their kids, absolutely help them get started on the housing ladder, not pay off an obligation which is highly contingent, and they'll only be paying at 9% above a earnings threshold. And if they ever have some blow and lose their job or their earnings falls, they won't be paying it.
Can I ask you about a policy that already exists, which is related to the points you were making, very interestingly, about deposits and also pensions? That is the lifetime ISA, lifetime ISA system, where, or I think I've roughly got this right. If you are, I think there's an age with anything up to your 40s, you can put in up to £4,000 a year.
Yeah.
And the state will give you an additional up to £1,000 a year. And you can use this either to put a deposit on your first property, or if you never buy a property, but for pension. That strikes me as it's a pretty generous scheme. I wonder what your thought is on that.
Yeah, and I'm pleased you say that, because actually I worked on the lifetime ISA in opposition before the Conservatives went into government in 2010. At the same time as I was writing The Pinch, it was absolutely designed to help with some of these cash pressures facing younger people in particular, and be a more flexible form of saving for those stages of the life cycle. Yeah, and its rules have changed over time, and some of the rules I think are too restrictive. I think it hasn't quite taken off the way I hope, because people find it quite hard to access in certain circumstances. But it's a fair point, and liberalising the LISA rules is definitely something we should look at.
Just bringing Andrea's question about the NHS. My point out that my wife, who's 50, uses her LISA as a lifetime savings account as a pot of money to offset the collapsing NHS. But when she's 60, she pulls out that tax subsidised, thank you very much, government, money to then pay for all the operations. So it's kind of an interesting way people are doing it. But my question is this: have you modelled what happens over, say, 15, 20, 30 years if this decline in fertility rate is not a cyclical blip that's going to come up like all the other ones? So, for example, when do we reach enough housing stock? All sorts of questions if we're in a declining population, and how that kind of changes the perspective. Have you done any work on that?
We have recently published a paper on the resolution on the fall in the birth rate, and this is where, look, I deliberately use the very crude figures, but TFR can be a bit misleading. We don't clearly, people are to some extent thinking that they are delaying having kids, but it looks as if the delay then quite often increasingly is becoming not having them at all. I think it's very dangerous for us to get into sort of telling people they've got to have kids because of the economic consequences. For me, another example actually of intergenerational unfairness is it does look as if people are having fewer kids than they would wish to have. So it does look as if there are external pressures, things like it's hard to get into secure housing, be it secure rented or property they own, that are affecting their willingness to have kids. So this is probably the low birth rate is telling us something about people, about the circumstances in which families now live. But in the long run, yeah, I think it does get tricky. And it goes back to the very first question. That is an environment in which you either need large scale migration to plug these gaps, or it is no accident that the countries with the worst very low birth rates, Japan, Korea, Italy, wearing a separate hat I wear, I do some work on technology. The countries leading in humanoid robots are Italy, Japan, Korea, and China. And And I tell you, and they are focusing on absolutely things like not just robots for factories, which the public debate tends to be, robots in social care, the extent to which people can build psychological, if they're living on their own and elderly, to what extent can they build personal psychological relationships with robots? And the regulatory issues are becoming things like, what if the software can be hacked and so your care robot can give financial advice telling you put all your savings into a bank account? But I tell you, the humanoid robot debate is very live in the countries that are 20 years ahead of this in this demographic change.